Welcome to Free Expression on the Weekend. First up, Jack Butler talks to columnist John J. Miller about the digital detectives who are searching for long-forgotten works by famous authors in some strange places.
Today we're going to talk about your latest column for Free Expression.
This was a fun story, and it definitely has an Indiana Jones vibe to it. The discovery of lost texts, and when you look back at literary history, all the different kinds of texts that we know are lost.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Aristotle wrote things that we know existed, but we don't have anymore. They're gone. History's full of examples like this, but it turns out there are some researchers in the United States who right now are discovering a bunch of lost texts by Walt Whitman through modern databases and search engines, hiding in plain sight an enormous amount of written work by Walt Whitman in newspapers, written under pseudonym, a manuscript tens of thousands of words long, also a novel, again, under a pseudonym, published serially in a newspaper. The recent discoveries, the most recent, have involved a series of newspaper editorials he wrote when he was a journalist in Brooklyn, arguing for improved sewers in Brooklyn. This was a passion of his. It sounds very niche, but it's also kind of exciting to realize one of the great American authors. We're finding new stuff by him now.
In the column, you talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Epic of Gilgamesh. How does the process of finding the text that you describe now compare to those sort of adventurous discoveries of the past?
Well, those other ones, those ones you mentioned, are almost archaeological discoveries.
Mm-hmm.
What we're finding now with this new wave of researchers is they're using the digital tools. In some cases, they're able to look at unpublished drafts of work Whitman wrote and discover actually where it did appear in print. But they're also finding examples like one scholar told me, Walt Whitman loved the word bamboozle.
Oh.
And so if you start looking for like that word in a Brooklyn newspaper in 1857, there's like a reasonably good chance that maybe Walt Whitman wrote it. And we're finding all this work by him and learning more about this guy who you would think is, is the scholarship on Walt Whitman complete. You might think, well, in the 21st century, of course it is. But it turns out, no, it's not. There's a lot to do. And we have these professors and academics and archivists who are finding new stuff.
And they're not being bamboozled.
No, they're not. They're figuring it out. They're learning a lot and they're bringing it to us.
What do you know of that still might be out there, or that the people you talk to think might be out there?
So they have a lot of theories about what might be out there. There are references and correspondence to things that may have been written but don't come down to us. For example, Nathaniel Hawthorne, as a young man, wrote a bunch of poems and sent them into a Boston newspaper. We know this from correspondence, and yet nobody's been able to find the poems. It may be that the newspapers no longer exist. They've all been destroyed. The white whale of all of this is...
I see where this is going.
Yeah, is a Herman Melville manuscript that may or may not exist. The Missing Novel by Herman Melville. Again, mentioned in his own correspondence that he was working on something called the Isle of the Cross. Go look it up. Go read the Wikipedia entry.
We have that. The Wikipedia entry has not been lost.
Right. Nobody really knows. There's no manuscript. Some scholars believe that he took some of this material and transformed it into some things that actually were published later on. There's different theories, but there is this romantic idea that somewhere there is a Herman Melville manuscript that nobody's read before. And if you don't go looking, nobody will find it.
Columnist Louise Perry writes this week about the fragile state of the British monarchy. King Charles has a lot more to worry about than his brother.
The royal family have been in a difficult spot for decades now. We have not seen a member of the royal family arrested by British police for 400 years, since King Charles I. So in that sense, that the Andrew scandal is more dramatic and more historically consequential than some of the other scandals that we've seen. But they have just been non-stop. I mean, everything surrounding Princess Diana, not just her death, but preceding that, there were all sorts of crises surrounding Diana, all sorts of crises surrounding the various divorces of the Queen's children. My argument in the piece is that this is an inevitable consequence of the fact that we have had an ideological revolution coming out of the 1960s. And that revolution is one that is really incompatible with the whole idea of monarchy. So even though the royal family have done their best to try and cozy up to the new ideological regime, and we have the king often talking about how much he values diversity, trying to incorporate non-Christian leaders within the coronation service. It doesn't work though, because progressives are fundamentally not well disposed towards the idea of monarchy, full stop. They've ended up actually alienating people on the right. I think it's something like 77% of over 65s of all ethnicities think that the monarchy is good for Britain, whereas only 19% of the youngest age category for ethnic minority Britons, so 18 to 24-year-olds, think the same thing. That is an enormous gap. It is so rare to encounter that big a gap actually on any issue. But when the king makes these statements about embracing diversity, I think what he possibly doesn't realise, or the people around him advising him don't realise, is that diverse Britain doesn't love him. I think last year almost half of babies born in Britain were born to ethnic minority families. So that's a very big change right on the horizon in terms of who is actually making up the British public and where that public support is coming from. I'm sure that there will be more and more members of the family who think, whether or not they want to have a big public spectacle like Harry and Meghan did, who think, why exactly am I signing up to this? To be tormented by the British media, to have my privacy intruded upon all the time, to be a powerless piñata, to have no actual political influence, but nonetheless to be made miserable by the attention of a public that is increasingly poorly disposed towards the monarchy. That the Princess of Wales, for instance, is particularly admirable, and actually in some senses she's the Queen's true spiritual heir, in the sense that she best embodies these now old-fashioned ideas of duty and stoicism. The hope among monarchists is that it is figures like the Prince and Princess of Wales who will be able to protect the institution from dissolution. The political winds are just blowing so strongly. Britain is in a point of flux in all sorts of ways. Whether progressivism becomes ever more powerful, in which case you would expect there to be less and less support for the monarchy, or if you see the rise of more radical right-wing political movements. But those parties are not necessarily, you might assume that they're made up of monarchists. That's not necessarily true. There's a lot of division on the right in terms of attitudes towards the monarchy. So I think the most likely scenario is that we see this sort of dwindling of support and funding, and maybe the institution fades away, but there are other alternatives. It's all to play for at the moment.
Thank you for watching Free Expression on the Weekend. We'll see you Monday morning in your inbox.